The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and welcome to today's ChemCareers webinar. Today we're going to be talking about a career in science policy. My name's Laura Woodward. I'm the careers specialist here at the Royal Society of Chemistry, and today we're joined by a panel. I'm going to get them to introduce themselves in a moment, who are all going to share their experiences of working in science policy and share some advice and top tips if you're thinking about a career in this field. So I'll get each of them to introduce themselves first.
So my name's Camilla Alexander-White. I'm Senior Policy Advisor in Environment and Regulation here at the Royal Society of Chemistry. So that means that I lead on all issues to do with chemicals regulation, and that's included Brexit in recent months, and also looking at environmental policies such as chemicals in air, land, water and waste.
I'm Tanya Sheridan. I am Policy and Evidence Manager here at the RSC, and I'm responsible for preparing clear evidence-based cases for policy changes and influencing in support of those policy changes in science policy, research and regulation policy affecting the chemical sciences.
I'm Julian Huppert. I actually now run a centre at Jesus College, Cambridge, called the Intellectual Forum, which is not a great name, do suggest some better ones, which is about getting people to think and talk about anything that's interesting and important, which of course covers a lot of scientific topics, a lot of technology topics. We've worked with the Wellcome Trust and all sorts of others. It also involves people like Jimmy Chu, Harry Shearer, Helen Clark and many others.
Brilliant, thank you very much. So I'm going to go through some questions with the panel. There will be an opportunity for you at the end to put your questions to the panel, and we will try to get through as many of those as we can at the end. Type those in as we're going through and as you're thinking of them, and like I said, I'll put those to the panel at the end. So just to start off with, I guess it would be useful to get an understanding from each of you about your sort of career journey and how you kind of ended up where you are today. So perhaps, Camilla, if we can start with you.
Okay. I never know if I've had a conventional journey into this or an unconventional one really, but I am a chemist, so I chose to do chemistry at degree level and also have a PhD in chemistry. So I guess I chose to specialise. I had an interest in toxicology from a very early age, from late teens, and so I brought together my chemistry and toxicology wishes and desires to work in that kind of career. And then I started at Imperial College after my postdoc doing research into skin allergy. So I ended up looking at cosmetics and food risk assessments. After being in academia at Imperial for a while, I joined industry. So I was at Unilever for 10 years, again working on chemical safety assessment. Then I moved to the Environment Agency, but again on chemical safety assessment. So I've had a focused thread around specialising in chemical safety assessment for about 20 years now. But it was that move, I think, to the Environment Agency from industry where I actually joined the civil service and got experience of applying science in policy that really, lit my fire. And then I wanted to do more of that. I didn't stay in civil service for various reasons at the time, but I moved into consultancy. But you could still then apply that same knowledge and science into developing policy. You're just working with government and with civil service as a consultant. So I've got experience in industry, civil service and consultancy. So I understand a range of sectors. So I've had an unusual journey, I think, in staying in the same kind of field but switching sectors to get more experience, and then I think that is useful now in the role I do, which is quite a focused role here. So I'm applying specialist knowledge in a very specific context here. Others may generalise, I think, if they want a science policy career, but that's been my route.
Brilliant. Julian, you next?
So I started off as a chemist and was very eager to do chemistry, although I have to say, as an undergrad, I meant to do 2 years of science and chemistry and then switch to law. And I never quite got round to that because I found chemistry too exciting and too interesting, which sounds a bit geeky. And then had a year off after I graduated before I did my PhD. Did a PhD in Cambridge working on DNA structure and function. which, well, I mean, I could tell lots of stories about it, but the first 2 years' work, not a word made it into my thesis because none of it actually worked. That's completely changed subject for my third year, but it worked quite well. And I then went on to get a fellowship, get an academic position, actually in the physics department here, because I persuaded them that, you know, it's all just physics, really. Yes, you should give me a job. So I was doing that work on structure and stability of unusual nucleic acid structures, but I'd always been juggling it with an interest in politics. I got into that when I was still at school, international human rights type issues, and so was always playing a bit with both of those as a Liberal Democrat. I was elected to the county council here in Cambridgeshire just before I started my PhD. I'm not sure my supervisor, the wonderful now Sir Shankar Balasubramanian, but you know we knew him before he was that grand. I'm not sure he was that impressed that I was a councillor at the same time as trying to do a PhD. They got through it, and then I guess I hadn't really planned out the career. So in 2009 I retired from politics. And then in 2010, I got elected as Member of Parliament here in Cambridge. So my retirement was not very successful. And I then spent 5 years as an MP and was one of only 2 Members of Parliament with a science PhD of any kind, both of us chemists. And so there were certainly some interesting times. So I got involved with a lot of how do you explain science, and maybe I'll say a bit more later about what that's like in Parliament. There are people who aren't scientists who get it. Historians can get it, but there are definitely people in Parliament who really don't get it at all.
Brilliant. And Tanya?
And I started life as a civil servant, so I'm probably more on the policy side than the science side. My experience in the civil service was mostly of making economic policy, but I worked with some great scientists who brought a brilliant perspective in making policy because they were the ones who could think in the most structured ways, and they were also the people who understood the complex scientific evidence that you needed to think through when you were thinking about things like how much nuclear material can you transport and what insurance do you need in case of any damage, or how precisely do you go about decarbonising the electricity grid in a way that is sustainable and meets the carbon targets. And so just when thinking about science policy careers, policy civil servant can actually be a great job for a scientist when you get to work on science policy areas. I then worked as an officer in local government, also at Cambridgeshire County Council, for about 3 years, where I was working on a range of economic development, planning and transport work. And there the experience was slightly different. Instead of making the policy and making the rules, you have to live within those policy guidelines and rules. You can influence them a bit, but it's also a very public-facing environment. It's a great place to learn about public engagement and communication, because if you're planning to build a new town on somebody's doorstep, they definitely want to come and talk to you about it, I can assure you that. And then 15 months ago, I came to the RSC to lead work on science research and regulation policy. But across these 3 very distinctive sectors, I'd say that there are some common themes and skills that are important for policy around being able to consult people in a meaningful but structured and strategic way, influencing, communicating a range of evidence and seeking and analysing that range of evidence. And they all involve really interesting issues which are particularly fun if you are interested in politics and policy.
Brilliant. Perhaps I'll stay with you, Tanya, then for the next question, which is what does a job in science policy actually involve? Why is it important, and why do you enjoy working in science policy?
What it involves is influencing decisions, whether it's government decisions, whether it's regional parliaments like the Scottish Executive and Scottish Government, European, UN, other conversations and decisions in order to make sure that science and scientific work and the needs of the science community are heard and respected in those discussions and debates. Why do I enjoy it? I like making a difference, and making a difference for something like science is very satisfying and very important in terms of making the world a better place, because the scientific method is about testing things and really knowing what works and what doesn't work. Things that give me the greatest satisfaction are learning about and communicating what science is doing to tackle the issues of our time. I love talking to RSC members about the science that they're doing, the challenges they're facing, and I love talking to policymakers about how those scientists are tackling them, particularly where it's something like environment and climate change, where I feel like it's very linked to both my values and the values of our scientific community.
Julian, I don't know whether you've got anything to add in terms of your sort of perspective on that.
Yeah, so I think one thing that I found was I went from doing research, which was, I mean, I could say rewarding, but it was also incredibly frustrating. You spend most of your time trying things that just don't work. So you bash your head against a brick wall, and then when you reach that triumph, it's quite hard to tell anyone about exactly what it is, because it often sounds a bit small. It's not always that great eureka moment, I've suddenly solved the entire problem. It's, I've now managed to get one further step down this synthetic route, or whatever it might be. So I went from doing that into, and I'll talk a bit more about the politics side of the science policy. I think they're actually closely related, where it is, as Tony says, it's about changing those decisions. So again, you find yourself banging your head against a brick wall, incredibly frustrating with things just not working. You're trying to get things to happen. But when a brick flies off, rather than just sort of going a short distance, it goes a hugely long way. So I remember back in 2010, just after the coalition government came in, there was a comprehensive spending review. And one of the big discussions was how much should there be in the science budget? And there were lots of people lobbying. There was Science is Vital campaign, there were the learned societies. I used my role as an MP to specifically lobby the 4 people who could do it. And, you know, you can't do the proper experiments to work out what actually mattered. But it meant that on the Sunday evening, I think it was, before the Wednesday, the science budget was going to be cut by 200 million. The Quad, who at that time, it feels like a long time ago now, were David Cameron, George Osborne, Nick Clegg, Danny Alexander, were meeting in Chequers for dinner. The phone rang and somebody said, I'm at the Treasury. We've rerun the numbers as 200 million spare. What shall we do with it? Nick said, let's put it in science. They all said, yeah, fine. And within half an hour, the science budget went up by 200 million quid. I have multiple sources for that other than it being Nick who said it, which is, you know, what he said. 200 million quid will be spent on all sorts of things. It will empower huge numbers of researchers to do things. I think my research was reasonably good and quite interesting, certainly to me, but no way would it have been as big as even, you know, a tiny fraction of that. So it's that scale of difference.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you. Moving on to the next question, Camilla. We often hear that it's difficult to get into science policy, but many of our members, certainly that we speak to in our team, are sort of interested. Perhaps especially those who've sort of maybe done their time in the lab or are thinking about doing something different. In your experience, what kinds of backgrounds do people come from who make that transition to policy jobs?
It is difficult to change careers. So when I moved from industry into civil service, and in order to do that, I took a step back in terms of pay, because it's a different set of skills for me. Yeah. So you're not on a continual career progression when you take that kind of step. So when you're moving from industry into policy, you'll find it quite difficult unless you're willing to do that. I think you've got to gain your experience from within. So I think some of the management experience I gained in industry was more useful actually than the science experience for this kind of role. So it's about organising meetings, getting people together, strategising, looking at topics. So it's those management aspects actually that helped in that transfer over from industry. I think if you're coming from academia, it will be different again. So it depends on where you're coming from. If you were a researcher in a lab and then you decided to move into a policy role, some of the strengths that you need to develop are writing skills, communication skills. Again, you might not have had that in an academic lab context, apart from speaking at conferences and getting out and about at conferences. But it's those writing and comm skills that you really need to develop. So there's a big transition from lab roles or even industrial management roles into a policy world. That you really only gain that experience once you've got into the role. So taking an internship, doing something that is like a step back is probably where most people would be if you were actually just moving from one sector to another there. If you're straight out of university, then I think you've probably got a lot of options open to you at that point. Again, at the intern level or the new graduate level, to start from the ground and then build your career on from that. So it really depends on what stage your career is at the moment, and the changes are different probably in respect to where you come from.
Tanya, I don't know if you've got anything to add to that.
A little story about one of our colleagues who has made that transition from a postdoc researcher in the lab to science policy, and she's done it very successfully. And I was just reflecting on what it is that she's done to be such a success in it. And I think she's voluntarily taken on various activities like science communication and particularly student representation on the sorts of bodies that talk to the organisations which influence science policy. So things like the Marie Curie Alumni Association that represent students but have that impact with the big decision makers. And through that volunteering and by a natural propensity to network, she has picked up those science policy skills really quickly. So I think Cam's advice is spot on about thinking about internships, thinking about communication, collaboration skills, so collaborating with other scientists in related fields, getting involved in public outreach or in student representation, the sort of thing that builds your communication and influencing skills. Think about science policy organisations like the RSC, other learned societies, Royal Society, when they've got graduate or internship opportunities. Also think about the civil service, science and engineering fast stream. It's good training and some very good jobs and potential expansion with Brexit.
Anything to add, Julian?
So I think there's some really good stuff being said already. I think the key thing for influencing policy is people who can understand how to answer somebody else's question. So quite a lot of people will say, here is a thing that's important because it's what I care about. And that just doesn't persuade somebody who isn't interested in your thing. So don't say there should be more money on scientific research because I'd like to be able to hire more people in my lab. Because, yeah, I'm sure you do, but that's not a very persuasive argument to anybody who isn't you. Understanding who are you trying to influence, what do they want, and how can I show the thing I'm trying to do is good for what they care about. They don't care about the details of chemical regulation. They probably do care about safety and the environment. Wrap it up in that space, and they'll be really interested and excited.
Yeah, brilliant, thank you. Julian, staying with you, I'm sure there's lots of misleading preconceptions about maybe what it's like to work in policy. I mean, I think that's probably true with lots of jobs, whatever career you kind of work in. Can you perhaps describe a day in your life or sort of previous things that you've done and sort of what most sort of occupies your time?
One of the things that I discovered as an MP was one of the worst things a politician can do is to change their mind on something. So we talk about this as a U-turn. You'll see newspaper headlines, somebody U-turns on something. In science, we generally call that, updating your views because the evidence tells you something different. Any scientist who tells you they've never had an idea that they realised was a bad idea is either really, really dull or lying. It's just not true. Whereas in politics, that is a huge problem. And the consequence of that, which took me a while to realise, is if you want to get things changed, the trick is to get them changed before they've been said. So once a minister or a regulator or somebody else has published the thing, announced the thing, it's now too late. Now, it's not impossible to change things, but it's a huge amount of work once it's been said. So actually a lot of what I used to do was to try to find out by chatting to people, gossiping, all that sort of things, what announcement is coming up next week? What announcement is coming out next month? How do I have the conversation? Because often on many things, the people in charge simply won't care what this paragraph says, or at least not care very much. And you can often say, well, if you could change it to be this thing, yeah, easy. So there were loads of times where I got, we got £20 million for cyclone improvements in Cambridge. So I managed to get one line changed very, very slightly. It was easy that way. Once it had been said, no way.
Yeah. Camilla, what about you? What takes up your time?
It's talking to people. Most of the time it's about talking to people, finding out what's coming up, as you say, in the weeks and months ahead, and then trying to shape our work so that it actually helps and brings solutions.
Yeah.
The other thing is networking with other scientists, because I can act as a connector to other scientists, and also interpreting quite complex situations and putting them into simple language, briefs, documents, position statements that can be more easily understood by the layperson. So that's a big part of the job, particularly when you're a scientist, because you understand the complex science that's being told to you by your community, in this case, our membership and others in our community, and then translating that into some language that will be understood. And it's hard. That's very difficult for a scientist to do. It's a bit of practice to do that. That's where I think most of my time is spent, talking to people and then translating evidence into useful text and language.
Brilliant, thank you. Julian, you've touched on some of this already, but from your perspective as a former MP, perhaps could you highlight how science policy really influences the work of MPs and politics generally?
At one level, science policy is crucial to the drivers of our economy. If you try to think what will power Britain economically in the next 20, 30, 40 years, if it's not science and technology, I don't know what it is. We're not going to be the agricultural hub feeding the world. It's not going to be raw manufacturing. It's got to be new things driven by science, driven by technology. Politicians, and I should say the same about civil servants in many ways, split into three groups. So there's a set who get it. They're not necessarily scientists themselves, but they understand how to talk to scientists, how to interpret things. They know when to look up or find out from somebody else what the details are. It's a small set. The vast majority of politicians and civil servants, they're the sort of people, we'll all know people like this who dropped sciences before A-level. They get that it's quite impressive, a bit scared of it maybe, don't really understand it, not quite clear whether it's magic or real science. So they're very enthusiastic, but they don't know how to ask the questions. And sometimes that means they underpeg the importance. And sometimes they come up with this idea, but science will let us do something. And you're like, well, not so much. There's then a small set in politics and the civil service who are, I would say, actively anti-science.
Oh, okay.
So there's a notorious Conservative MP, David Tredinnick, who gave a famous speech in 2009 calling for more money to be spent on astrology research. And he said something like that the moon has a huge effect on our lives. For example, surgeons won't operate during a full moon because blood clotting is ineffective. Now, I may not have got that quite word for word, but check in Hansard and you'll get. Now, I've actually checked that, and surgeons do operate during the full moon, and I don't know if anybody listening has ever cut themselves during full moon and survived. But and so there's a real challenge, and this matters because some of that hijacks. So David was on the Science Technology Select Committee, the Health Select Committee. You can see the consequences. But it also happens, as I said, in the civil service, there was a proposal in Department for Education, I think it was, around 2010, 2011, to ban the use of explosives in a classroom. And that seems, maybe sensible, maybe a bit, oversafe. The working definition that was being used for an explosive was any exothermic reaction. Now, if you're a chemist or a physicist, you know that quite a lot of reactions are exothermic and most of them aren't very dangerous. Yeah. But the people working on it just didn't have that level of language. And it wasn't until it progressed a bit further that somebody said, that doesn't make sense.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. Thank you. Tanya, you've touched on some of this already, but what do you think are the key qualities and skills of a successful science policy specialist?
I think it's the communication and influencing skills. And as Cam says, you've got to be able to talk well and be able to write well and persuasively as well. It's an interest in both science and in politics and the policy process. You've got to be interested enough and understand enough of the science to be able to interpret from a perhaps quite technical paper or seminar to its practical implications in the real world. So, for example, just taking Julian's example of the exothermic reactions, being able to communicate how an ordinary classroom reaction is actually exothermic and quite explosive, but completely safe because all it's creating is perhaps some water. And you need to be able to think strategically about how that science can inform policy debates. You should be a good networker and collaborator. I mean, as Cam and Julian have very eloquently set out, it's about intelligence gathering and working out what's coming up, reading the politics and where the decision makers are going. And it's about being able to seek, find, assess and absorb a range of different evidence. So being interested not just in the scientific evidence, but also that economic evidence and that economic language. If you can speak different languages in terms of vocabulary, of economics, of social policy, of regional benefit, of the science, that's really helpful as well. And then finally, that ability to develop a picture of what needs to change and why, and communicate it compellingly.
Camilla, I don't know whether you'd add anything.
Yeah, I could build everything. I agree with what Tanya said there. And I'd just say I've seen so many scientists bamboozle people. That's the thing, you know, and as Julian's saying, you're talking to a real broad range of people with very different levels of understanding. And then you see scientists go in an incredible level of detail sometimes, just overwhelming people, and they do get scared, I think, and run away, and so tend to then try and say, we don't want to talk to these scientists because we don't understand what they're saying. Yes. So that skill of being able to get good comms skills, you know, that ability to speak to people at a level that's appropriate to knowledge and understanding, whilst being influential at the same time and getting things changed and done without bamboozling. That's a real skill.
Yeah, absolutely. Julian, I don't know whether you'd add anything.
No, and I think the most important thing is that communication thing that Cam and Tanya have spoken about, because you want to persuade somebody. And if you are communicating well but they don't hear it, you haven't communicated well, you've got it wrong. So I think that is the most important thing. There's also something about being able to build credibility, because to some extent what you want is for somebody to say, when we're thinking about regulation in toxicology, what we do is we ring Camilla up and we say, what should this say? So the question is, how do you get yourself so that you're not, there's always a balance. There's a lot of political theory about when you sort of shout and when you work quietly. But you want to be the person where the person making a decision will ring up and say, look, I've got to write this thing about this. Can you tell me what should be there? And that, in some ways, that's really success, when they just trust you enough. You've built up that reliability. They just copy your thing into the document. Then you've won.
Yeah.
And it takes a while, doesn't it, to really build up that credibility.
Yes. Julian, if you were recruiting someone into your team, or with wanting to do science policy, what would make an application stand out to you in terms of what they could express to you?
So I think it depends at what sort of level, but showing that you've had some engagement in some way. You know, we've touched on this a bit already, but there are various student organisations that do things. There are if you're a PhD student, there's the amazing scheme run by the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology, where you can go and spend 3 months working in Westminster. You know, that's an amazing opportunity. If there's anybody listening who's thinking about it, you get 3 months extra pay to go and work in London doing something interesting. I mean, what's not to like? You can try and work out what's going on in Brexit at the moment. But I'd want to see somebody who's tried doing something like that, because there are lots of light touch ways of doing that. Can I also say, for anybody who's interested in politics, and I know it's got a bit of a dirty word at the moment, but it really matters. There's a lovely line from The West Wing, that decisions are made by those who show up. And in general, scientists avoid getting involved in politics because it's a bit messy.
Yeah.
It feels a bit wrong. And I know lots of scientists who care about things, but it's not really my thing. And the thing is, if we don't show up, it's other people who make the decisions.
Who believe in astrology.
Yeah. So one thing I would say is, if you're listening, whatever your politics are, your party needs people like you who can help them to be better, and that's true for any party at all. They all have some sort of science grouping. Get involved, do something, think about it, because we all despair about politics at times. But actually, if we want it to be better, running away doesn't help.
Yeah, no, I think that's really good advice. Tanya, I don't know whether you'd add anything in terms of what would stand out to you.
I'd certainly echo that. Think about what you want to change in the world and have that example of how you sought out to make a change in the world, whether it's going along to a meeting of your local authority to try and change a proposal on, say, air quality or something to incorporate the science, or changing something in your university or your employer, and also show that you understand the role and showcase what you can bring to it.
Yeah, Camilla, I don't know whether.
Yes, I agree with what Julian and Tanya are saying. The scientists have to get involved. So I've worked a lot in the UK community, but for last year I went to a UN meeting on chemicals regulation. It was the first time I've been to one of those for a while. And I was just staggered. I said, where are all the scientists? This is a core issue about chemicals in the environment. It's called the Strategic Approach to International Chemicals Management. 400 people maybe in the room, maybe 10 scientists, if that you could identify as scientists in that kind of forum. And I was just staggered at the fact that there weren't scientists in there. So I would just say, if you are a scientist, as you say, get involved in these things, because if you're not there, your voice won't be heard. And there's a lot of that about at the moment. So encouraging scientists into this kind of world is really important, because they're alien worlds to each other. The worlds of politics and science are really far apart at the moment. So the science policy interface is a real thing to resolve in the UK and in the international groups that you may work in as well.
Yeah. Staying with you, Camilla, what advice would you give to someone starting out on how to progress their career successfully in science policy? We've touched on this a bit, but any sort of top tips or advice?
You do have to have an interest in current affairs. So listen to radio, listen to multiple sources of things, not just the same. But really become interested in the world around you and what's going on. And then you really speak in the language of science policy just by engaging with the world around you, really. What would I say more tangibly, though? Yeah, hone your writing skills. That's a really important thing to be able to do, to write a brief within the space of hours on a topic that's on one or two sides, really hard, so practice that. And then just go out giving presentations to various different types of audiences.
Yeah. Julian, I don't really add anything.
So one thing about science policy, you can often start off doing a bit of it on the side of something else. And I think that's probably a really good way to go, to try, rather than saying I'm going to abandon one career and do a completely different thing cold, because you may decide you don't like it. So you can do these various internships. There's the Royal Society does a parliamentary pairing scheme with civil servants and politicians. There's a whole bunch of things like that. There's going to local events, as Tanya mentioned. Have a look at the Science and Technology Select Committee or some of the other select committees and see the inquiries they're doing. If any of them are in an area that you know something about, write in response to their questions with some evidence. You might get asked to appear. It's unlikely, and but it's a great opportunity if you do. But even if you don't, what you've written in will be read, will be considered, will be published as part of the report. So you can try doing things like that. You can get involved with the learned societies who will be doing things pretty much everywhere. Do something, and if the bug gets you, then you'll have an easier route to do more.
Brilliant, thank you. Just before I sort of finish off with my questions, just to remind you, if you do want to ask any questions, if you type those in, and we'll try and get to those. So if you've got any sort of specific questions that you want to ask the panel, you want to put those in. And I guess just from me, just sort of finishing off, perhaps starting with you, Tanya, perhaps just any sort of advice that you would sort of give or share to anyone kind of aspiring to a career in this field.
I think set yourself a goal of something you want to do related to what you know about that will change the world. Go out and do it, and then track and monitor it, and write it up as a nice example when you apply for a science policy job.
Yeah, absolutely. Camilla, anything to add?
Yeah, it is good to talk about things you know. You'll soon be found out if you're talking about things that you don't know. So I would say stick to something you know. Yeah, and just be confident, because it's all about being confident as well. You know, you have to go in a room and just talk to anybody. So it's that confidence.
Julian?
So 2 things. One is go for it.
Yes.
You will find that things don't move as quickly as you wanted, and just be prepared for that. And you will have the frustration that you'll rarely know that it was definitely your work that made the difference. It's hard to run experiments in that way, but you do make a difference, and it matters. The other thing, just say on the political side, go for it. If you're having trouble getting connections in a political party or anything like that, drop me an email. My email address is easy enough to find, but it's jlh29@cam.ac.uk. Happy to try and point you in the right direction, you know, whether I share your politics or not. You know, but actually happy to help people get into it, because we need you in all of these areas of science policy.
Brilliant, thank you. So we've had some questions starting coming in, and actually a couple of them on sort of a similar theme around how important is it to have a PhD? Camilla,
I would say it's not necessarily important to have a PhD to do this kind of work. You can see I've got letters after my name though. So I'm a chartered chemist, a fellow of the Royal Society, and Eurotox registered toxicologist. And if nobody knows you, that does give some level of credibility, I'm afraid to say. It shouldn't, but in some ways I'm always torn with this. Maybe it should, maybe it shouldn't. So I say you don't need to do a PhD, but you do need to be credible and find a way of showing your credibility somehow.
Yes.
And, you know, the accreditation schemes do that. For me, in my world, you have to have registered status to be able to do some of the work in this, because the guidance requests it. So there's things around credibility more than qualifications.
Yeah, don't know whether you've got any thoughts, Julian.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. It's that credibility thing. You know, I was saying earlier how you need to be the person people reach out to. If you come across as not knowing what you're talking about, people aren't going to listen to you. The PhD isn't the only way of doing that. It's one way. It also depends slightly what area you want to get into. If you want to be the expert in a particular thing, such that you are the person who knows everything there is to know about something, then probably a PhD is quite useful.
Yes.
But the more you're doing broader science policy, a PhD isn't necessary. Many of the best people I worked with across the learned societies who did science policy didn't have PhDs. A number of them hadn't even studied science.
Yeah.
You know, you can do really good science policy without even a science degree, because it's about getting it. So you want to be a specialist, you want to be the expert in a particular area, PhD is very useful. Otherwise, it's about getting it and knowing who to talk to.
Great, brilliant. Tanya, perhaps the next one for you. What organisations would hire science policy advisors?
Learned societies, so the likes of the Royal Society of Chemistry, Institute of Physics, would have small policy advisor teams. Royal Society, Wellcome, perhaps have slightly bigger teams, and other Royal Academies like the Royal Academy of Engineering. There are some smaller learned societies like the Geological Society, Royal Society of Biology, which again will have a few vacancies but may look for a more general skill set. Civil service, particularly departments like the Food Standards Agency, where CAM is one of the advisors on one of their scientific bodies, and the Environment Agency, the Health and Safety Executive, but also government departments like the Department of the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, the Department for Transport and the Ministry of Defence particularly, which have a lot of science input. They will all have good roles. There may be some openings in local government, particularly authorities that have a significant air quality issue in the larger authorities like London. And there are, of course, openings in the private sector, so large pharmaceutical companies like AstraZeneca, GSK would have specialist regulatory teams that would need scientists with a good understanding of drug discovery related science, and other large corporations would also have those sorts of opportunities.
Just chip in as well. I think it's a brilliant list. I mean, I was obviously to scribble down a list myself for that. There's a website, W4MP Jobs, which has quite a lot of policy positions. It will include things other than science related. There's a lot of healthcare things down there as well. It was originally about people who want to work for an MP, but is now very, very broad in that area, and you can search it by, voluntary, paid, all sorts of other things.
Great, brilliant. Just can't see all the questions, just bear with me. So someone here asking, as an EU national, do you think I might have a chance to contribute to UK politics and government as doing science policy? Everybody's nodding.
Valuable contribution. Look out for guidance on things like settled status in the light of Brexit. Looking at our science policy team, out of 6 of us, I think 2 are non-UK nationals with another EU passport.
So someone here is saying, Julian mentioned the importance of this field with Brexit, inverted commas, coming. Could the panel talk more on how much? We can perhaps do another webinar on that.
I mean,
any sort of thoughts?
Well, I'm at risk of becoming too political. I'm still hopeful we can avoid it because I think it'll be catastrophically stupid for the country. But I know there are people who disagree with me on that. I have to say, I think when the referendum was happening, we'd simply said, if you vote to leave, we will keep talking about this for years to come. Yeah. There would have been a massive vote to remain. It was a really missed opportunity. Here is what the newspapers will say in a couple of years. Oh, okay. But I think it will, if we make the tragic assumption that we are going to leave in some sort of way, it will matter hugely because those rules and regulations and harmonisation are going to be utterly essential to get right. We can't run or support or sensibly have a system where the law in detail in England is different from the rest of Europe. It would make no sense whatsoever. It would be incredibly expensive. We don't want to reassess everything in a slightly different way. So yes, I think it's going to be, if we do leave, it's going to be really toxic for a while. Maybe we'll rejoin after that, but I still hope we can skip that.
Someone here asking, what tips would you have for surveying sort of current information and affairs? Do you follow any specific news outlets, committees, resources? Tanya, perhaps do you want to start with that one?
I tend to listen to BBC News, and particularly because you all hear from cabinet ministers and opposition, a range of different parties. Question time. Have a look at a range of different newspapers, just even to understand their perspectives. Follow different political correspondents on Twitter, like Sam Coates. It can be quite interesting following your local MP on Twitter as well, just to see what their take is and what's going on. But also, if you're looking for some serious, really good evidence, the House of Parliament Library is my favourite first go-to point if I want to gem up on or learn about something.
Julian, I don't know whether you.
So Twitter for me is the main source, because Twitter at its worst can be awful. Twitter at its best can be a really good way of just getting the messages that you're trying to get. I think Tanya's absolutely right, though. Make sure you stay broad. If you only hear within an echo chamber, you'll think everyone else thinks like that. When it comes to talking about somebody else, something, you will assume everybody thinks the same to start with, and you will just get it wrong. So try to stay broad. But there are some amazing people from, welcome from the RSE, there are all sorts of others on Twitter which will give you a nice pointer. They can also act as useful tools to filter things to you. So if you follow a few people in science policy, they will retweet other things in science policy. And so it's quite a good way of getting a sense of how things are going more generally. I find it much better, certainly for my blood pressure, than things like BBC News increasingly. I think there are people who watch Question Time still. I don't.
Brilliant. That's been great. Oh, I've just got one more question. Time for one more question. That'd be a bit too.
They do more.
Yes.
Should
we say what the question is for anyone else who's not?
Asking if the BBC could do more in terms of sort of educating people around sort of science and sort of scientific policy.
Yes.
Who wants to take that one first?
I'll say so. I do listen to all the BBC sources, but I think there's good science programs like Horizon, things like that. They do a lot of things like that. But in terms of the news, it's all economics, and business, and there's very little on science. So when the science items come up, they don't appear to be very well researched or communicated very well. So they could do a lot more, I think, on communicating the science topics on some of the flagship programs in particular, which a lot of people still do listen to.
I mean, things like the Today programme, when a science thing's coming, there's almost a pride in not understanding the words, and, as though a really proper person wouldn't understand this stuff. Yes. And actually, I think that's a huge shame, and actually does let the BBC down. So there are some brilliant science journalists in the BBC and elsewhere who are utterly fantastic, but they find it hard to get the space and the time. And I think it's also because increasingly the BBC and other media like the idea that every story is a two-sided, he says, she says type thing. And science isn't really like that. Actually, most of us, if we're any good at science, don't say the answer is and can only be this thing, because very rarely is the evidence completely clear-cut. And so actually, if anything, they weaken science, things like climate change, where I say let's hear from both sides. Yes, well, let's hear from the side that believes there's gravity and the side that believes there isn't. It's absurd.
Absolutely. I just jotted down one last question, which was around how important networking is to someone sort of building their career. I don't know if anyone can sort of elaborate on that, or sort of thoughts, perhaps just to sort of finish off the questions today. Tanya, perhaps you want to take that one.
I'd say vital, whether you're building yourself a scientific career, a science policy career, a science communication career, or a hybrid of that. Because if you're going to stay in science and research, you need that network to think about who am I going to work with in order to solve this complex interdisciplinary scientific question. If you're going to go into science policy or science communication, that is your source of ideas, of intelligence, of people who can give you tips, and people that you can give tips to, people that you can bring together in order to generate the events that give you the ideas for policy. So absolutely do it. And probably the most important thing I'd say about networking is enjoy it.
Yes.
Think about it as discovering fun people, nice connections, and having great conversations that give you and the other person some good ideas.
Brilliant. And I think that's a really nice kind of tone to end the webinar on. So thank you to all of you who've sort of talked this afternoon. I've personally found it really interesting and actually getting a better understanding of actually the sort of the nuances and the breadth of skills that you actually really need to sort of have that successful career. So thank you for your time, and thank you to those of you who submitted questions today. Just before we sort of finish the webinar, I know some of you will be members, some of you won't be members who are listening, but just a reminder there of the support that you can get as a member of the Royal Society of Chemistry. So things there around career development. Obviously, we talked a lot around sort of professional recognition, which again is important, and really importantly, out on the bottom there, sort of linking in with what we've just talked about, those connections, so those networks that you get access to, organised by sort of interest, geography, and things like that. So if you're not a member, obviously do consider that and think about that in terms of your career as well. And from my perspective, just to remind you all of the career support that you get from the Royal Society of Chemistry as a member. So that includes one-to-one careers consultations. So whether that's getting advice on shaping your CVs, getting interview practice, thinking about how to sort of network effectively or find jobs. We also offer a mentoring scheme and run these webinars as well on a monthly basis. And if you need anything, you can email me at careers@rsc.org. So thank you again to the panel, and thank you to those of you who've listened today. I hope you found it of use and interest.